In the spring of 1889, the city of Johnstown, Pennsylvania, sat quietly inside a narrow mountain valley. Steel mills operated day and night. Railroad tracks carried iron and coal across the region. Families lived in tightly packed neighborhoods along the rivers. High above the city, hidden in the Allegheny Mountains, a massive reservoir waited behind a dam. Most residents rarely thought about it. But on May 31st, 1889, that dam suddenly failed. Within minutes, an entire lake began racing toward the city. What followed became one of the deadliest disasters in American history. Life in Johnstown before the flood. Before the disaster, Johnstown was a thriving industrial town. Located where the little Conemaugh River met the Stony Creek River, the city had grown rapidly during the late 19th century. Steel production powered the local economy. Railroads connected the city to major markets across the United States. Workers from many parts of Europe had settled there. The town was crowded, busy, and full of life. But the geography that supported Johnstown's growth also created a hidden danger. The city sat at the bottom of a steep valley surrounded by mountains. Water from the surrounding hills naturally flowed toward the town, and high above that valley stood a structure that held back an enormous reservoir. The dam above the city, about 14 miles upstream from Johnstown, stood the South Fork Dam. Behind it was Lake Conemaugh, an artificial reservoir containing nearly 20 million tons of water. The dam had originally been built decades earlier as part of a canal transportation system. But after the canal era ended, the reservoir was purchased by a private organization known as the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. The club was an exclusive retreat for wealthy industrialists. Its members included some of the most powerful businessmen in America at the time. They used the lake for boating, fishing, and relaxation during the summer months. However, the dam itself had a troubling history. Over the years, several important safety features had been altered. Drainage pipes which lowered water levels had been removed. The dam was lowered during repairs, reducing the margin of safety. Engineers had warned that the structure might not withstand extreme rainfall. Despite these concerns, the reservoir remained full, and the city of Johnstown continued its daily life below. The storm. In late May of 1889, a powerful weather system settled over western Pennsylvania. For days, rain fell across the mountains. Streams and rivers began to rise rapidly. The ground became saturated. Water flowed downhill toward the reservoir behind the South Fork Dam. By the morning of May 31st, the lake level had risen dangerously close to the top of the dam. Workers attempted emergency measures. They tried digging channels to release water. They attempted to reinforce parts of the structure with earth and debris, but the rainfall continued. The pressure against the dam kept increasing. At approximately 3:10 in the afternoon, the structure finally gave way. When the dam failed, when the South Fork Dam collapsed, the entire contents of Lake Conemaugh surged into the valley. Millions of tons of water suddenly began rushing downhill. The flood wave grew larger as it traveled. Trees were uprooted. Buildings were torn apart. Railroad bridges were ripped from their foundations. The moving wall of water gathered debris as it moved forward. Farmhouses vanished instantly. Livestock, timber, and machinery were swept into the torrent. In some areas, the flood wave was estimated to reach heights of 40 feet. By the time it approached Johnstown, it had transformed into a massive moving wall of debris. Residents in Johnstown had little warning. Some people noticed rising water levels in nearby rivers. Others heard distant rumbling sounds from upstream, but there was almost no time to escape. When the flood reached the city, it struck with tremendous force. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed within minutes. Buildings were lifted from their foundations and carried through the streets. Families were separated as houses collapsed. The moving debris eventually slammed into a large stone railroad bridge. Instead of passing through the bridge, the debris became trapped. Houses, trees, railroad cars, and entire structures piled together. A massive wall of wreckage formed against the bridge. Hundreds of people were trapped inside this tangled mass. Then, something even more horrifying happened. Oil leaking from destroyed industrial equipment ignited. The pile of debris caught fire. People who had survived the flood now faced flames while trapped in the wreckage. The aftermath. When the floodwaters finally receded, the devastation was almost unimaginable. Entire sections of the city had disappeared. More than 2,200 people had died. Thousands more were injured or left homeless. Bodies were discovered miles downstream. Some victims were never identified. In response to the disaster, relief workers from across the country traveled to Johnstown. The American Red Cross, led by Clara Barton, established shelters, hospitals, and food distribution centers. It became one of the first major national disaster relief efforts in United States history. But even after the flood ended, another danger remained: the threat of disease. After the waters receded, the city faced a serious public health threat. Thousands of bodies remained trapped beneath debris. Dead animals lay scattered throughout the valley. Drinking water sources had become contaminated with mud, sewage, and decaying material. Physicians feared that an epidemic might follow the disaster. Historically, large floods often triggered outbreaks of infectious disease. Doctors warned that illnesses such as typhoid fever, cholera, and dysentery could spread rapidly through the surviving population. Newspapers predicted that a second disaster might be approaching. But relief workers acted quickly. Debris was cleared. Victims were recovered and buried. Contaminated wells were closed. Food and clean water were distributed under controlled conditions. Because of these sanitation efforts, the massive epidemic that many feared never developed. Historians now consider the Johnstown response an early example of organized disaster public health management. Why the flood was so powerful. From a scientific perspective, the Johnstown flood demonstrates the destructive energy stored behind large dams. Water held in a reservoir contains gravitational potential energy. When the barrier holding that water fails, the stored energy is rapidly converted into kinetic energy. The result is a powerful flood wave capable of carrying enormous objects. Buildings, locomotives, and entire forests can be moved by such forces. Modern dam engineering now incorporates many safety measures designed to prevent these disasters. These include emergency spillways, structural monitoring, flood control systems, and evacuation planning for downstream communities. Many of these safety practices were strengthened after disasters like Johnstown. Legal controversy. After the flood, investigators examined the cause of the disaster. Evidence showed that the South Fork Dam had been poorly maintained. Several engineering modifications had reduced the dam's ability to safely release water. Many people believed the private club that owned the reservoir should be held responsible. However, the legal system at the time made it extremely difficult to assign liability. Courts ultimately ruled that the disaster was an act of nature. As a result, the owners of the dam were never held legally responsible for the tragedy. This outcome sparked national debate about industrial responsibility and public safety. Today, the city of Johnstown has rebuilt. But the events of May 31st, 1889 remain one of the most powerful reminders of how quickly infrastructure failure can change history. Sometimes disasters are not caused by nature alone. Sometimes they occur when human systems fail under pressure. And when that happens, the consequences can unfold in minutes. The Johnstown flood stands as a reminder that engineering decisions, maintenance, and public safety are never trivial matters. Because sometimes, a single failure can release an entire lake. The Johnstown flood reminds us that sometimes disasters are not caused by nature alone, but by human decisions.